Okay, and welcome everyone to our June community of practice for COVES. The focus today is an aggregate data share out, but I don't mean to have misled anyone. We need to start this call with some survey updates. This is important for making sure everyone's on the same page, and the survey changes that we're going to discuss will go into effect July 1st for all participants. So I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. Please do follow up with the COVES team directly if you have any questions whatsoever about these changes or how you think it might impact your data or anything else. So I'm going to begin sharing. And again, I'm going to move quickly through this first section so we can try and save as much time on the call for our aggregate data and planning the fiscal year report that we will begin working on July 1st for broad dissemination. So primarily, there are 8 changes that we're going to be making to the core instrument. Again, this will affect almost every single one of you. I say almost because some of you have site-specific changes that kind of led to these broader implementation for the many cohorts. So you can see the summary right here. There are 8 that we're going to discuss, and I'm going to go over them very quickly. So for the LGBT plus question, you can see in gray the original phrasing and in blue the new phrasing. We are adding Q, queer, to this acronym, and the response options will go unchanged. Again, several of you actually already have this version of the question on your survey through consultation with our questions and measures team and getting some expert input. This was seen as a very good change to make so that we can be as inclusive as possible. The second change that we're going to be making for all COVES members is a change to the response options for the household income question. You can see that there were a lot of response categories previously, and we're consolidating those top 3, if you will, the 200,000 to more than 300,000 into more than 200,000 for 2 reasons. One, the current version of the question seems to place an emphasis on higher earners, whereas through our focus on equity and inclusion and other considerations of who is visiting our museums, we want to place more of an emphasis on some of the less represented lower income categories. The second reason is this is in alignment with the American Community Survey data. So when you make comparisons to your local area census, the new coding will actually directly align and you won't have to consolidate any of your data points. So we're going to be removing this, and that should actually make it easier for respondents to complete the survey. The third change we're going to be making probably needs no explanation whatsoever. We're going to randomize the disability categories. For some reason, which I will just say is my own fault, they have been static for a long time, but they've been in no particular order. They're not alphabetical. They're not purposefully aligned. So rather than trying to dig too deep into whether there's an order effect created by this, we're just going to randomize the 5 primary response options for this while anchoring prefer to self-describe and prefer not to say at the bottom. The next change we're going to make is actually something that I'll probably need communication from all of you about at one point or another, because we're going to make the number of previous visits in the last 12 months optional. So if you were looking for an area to reduce the number of questions on your survey, you could remove this entirely. If you want to keep it, that's obviously fine. But the primary change we're making here is we're changing the format of this question from an open-ended response to a closed-ended response. The phrasing here in blue is actually the current question. So, for example, if you visited one other time in addition to this visit in the past 12 months, you would enter the number 2. This has a tendency to stumble some of our visitors in their responses. So we're going to change it to, prior to this visit, how many times in the past 12 months have you visited? And you can see the closed-ended options here. This aligns with the way we have reported the data historically, so there shouldn't be a change to any of your data if you want to keep this. Several of you I know have tried to compute an average or have looked for particularly those people who skew very highly on this number continuum. We cap it out at 365 for obvious reasons. But if you're looking for that numeric data, we can actually include the optional write-in for people who select 10 or more. This was decided to, we decided to make this change, again, for 2 reasons. One, We're looking for areas to shorten the survey. 2, we're less confident about the higher numbers that visitors respond with. So even if they are very frequent visitors, unless they come with a specific cadence like one a week and can put in the number 52 pretty accurately, it's not going to lead us to a high degree of reliability with those open-ended response numbers. And we're primarily interested in, the 1 to 10 options anyway. Again, this is something that I will try and communicate with you individually about, so you can customize your survey as it fits your needs. But again, this will be optional, and you can opt out or opt in to this question moving forward. Respondent age. So there are 2 versions of the age question on the survey. One is for the person filling out the survey, and the other is for the rest of the group members, both adults and children. The what is your age question has historically been an open-ended response, right? Like a fill in the blank, but numeric responses only. When we designed the question, this made a lot of sense, or at least I thought this made a lot of sense, because if I'm responding to the survey, I know my own age. Well, as it turns out, I've either been working on COVES too long, or I'm just getting too old, because I actually stumble over my age sometimes, and I have to do a little bit of math and just remember, which age number am I? And so for that reason, and in addition to the fact that this can be harder for visitors to answer because they have to pull up the numeric keypad and fill it out, we're changing this to a select one response where people can actually fill this out. And importantly, the respondent themselves can prefer not to say. For almost all of the demographic questions, we've had that prefer not to say option, but because of the write-in response to this, we've been unable to add that until now. So we're going to change the format of the question to simplify things. Again, if you have been computing an average for respondents for any reason, we can probably accommodate that for you, but our strong encouragement is the core question is going to be a select one response from now on. The race ethnicity question, the text is a little small here, but the takeaway is we're going to add a response option that's included in bold here, Middle Eastern or North African. So this is a move that is coming in alignment with changes to the census, but we are being forward thinking, and we've been encouraged to consider this response option for a while now. We are going to add it because we want to have the data before the census data are available. So we will be prepared to make direct census comparisons when that change is made, rather than having a lag, changing our question once the census data are available and then needing to catch up. We are also going to add a statement at the end of this question that says, please answer only for yourself, not for others in your group. So this aligns with the thinking that the majority of the demographic questions ask the respondent to complete the personal identification questions about themselves rather than everyone in their group. If you're in the Science Plus cohort, this has actually been in place for a few months. And if you're in the Art or Art Bridges cohorts, this will be added. And we're going to keep all the rest of the response options as is for now. The next change, which will affect the race ethnicity somewhat, is the order of the questions on the demographics page. If this slide looks confusing, you don't need to worry too much about it, other than to say is we've reordered the questions so that all of the ones that refer to self, right, my identity, I'm filling out the survey, are going to come first, while all of the group ones are going to come at the end. Again, if you saw the stem for the disability question, it asks about you and others in your group. So that's why it's considered one of the group demographic questions. We also did this to try and make any potentially sensitive items come farther down on the page so that we don't discourage people from giving us their truest identity or the fullest set of data that we can get. So you can see that LGBT plus and income is our most frequently prefer not to say response option. Both of those are going to come at the tail end of the self-demographic questions. We're also making a change, and this is the last question that I'm going to review for survey implementation for July 1st. We're making a change to the education response options, and we're doing this primarily because when we added the art museum cohort 3 years ago, we made subtle changes to the response options, and we never brought those two into alignment. But I'm happy to report that through the hard work of our questions and measures team, we are going to fully align the science and art groups so that there's no discrepancy anymore. We're also going to add this statement, please answer only for yourself, not for others in your group. So it's the highest level that you have attained as far as education. And here you can see all of those response options. So the bold on the right-hand side of the slide are what will be the response options starting July 1st. There is no fundamental change to the way you will need to report the data. This is in full alignment with American Community Survey census data. So again, making comparisons to your local community will be very easy. What we've done is tried to take into account some of the nuance that was incorporated when we rethought this question a few years ago. So you can see that adding GED equivalent to that high school degree component is important, separating out college degree into associate's degree or bachelor's degree. And for all the art museum folks, we're dropping the parentheticals about a 2-year program or a 4-year program because we actually don't have confidence that it takes 2 years or 4 years if you're on an accelerated track or depending on the requirements of the school. And then simplifying the graduate degree from master's and beyond just to graduate degree, dropping any reference to professional degree because the hope is that people who have that know what it is, and it's actually not a linear trajectory from a bachelor's degree to, for example, master's or beyond. What does beyond master's mean? You can go directly from a bachelor's degree to a PhD program or an MD or something like that. So there's a lot of different tracks. We're going to make sure that there's a prefer to self-describe option for all because especially in today's age of the internet, there's a lot of different ways to get very fancy certifications in different degrees. We want to make sure people have the option to tell us more about their specific highest level of education attained through this question. But again, this should provide the best, most reliable method of comparing to census data possible while aligning the science and art surveys. So that was the extremely fast summary of all the survey changes. Again, we'll send a summary of this via email in case folks aren't on the call today. And we'll also correspond with you directly about the site-specific changes that you do or do not want to make in alignment with these changes. Okay, I'm going to keep pushing really fast because I want to turn it over to Alex in a few minutes to share some of the data. But first, we're going to do that annoying part, which is like, what are we talking about here? And what are the key takeaways as far as the data that I'm looking at before I get to the results. So welcome all of you. 83 sites contributed data at some point in 2023. So even though we're in June of 2024, we're looking back at the calendar year from last year, kind of the most tight year-long period that we could get our hands on. And as mentioned, this teaser of the aggregate data is the springboard to the fiscal year analysis that we're going to take on next month for a full aggregate report that we're going to print in beautiful colors and send to all of you or something, or make available to all of you. Through those 83 sites, the sample size was over 38,000, tremendous statistical power. This is fantastic. However, there are a few caveats because not all of those data are included in the analysis. Specifically, we had 16 sites with samples under 100. Historically, this has been our sample threshold cutoff. If sites are not collecting at least 100 surveys in a year, then that leads to more sample bias, more response bias, and more imprecision in the data. So you need to collect a sufficient amount of data in order to be included in the aggregate analyses. 16 sites had to be cut from this because of that threshold. Additionally, through the implementation of the QR code, 13 sites had QR responses totaling more than 33% of their overall sample. And as you can see in parentheses, 66% was the average of those sites, meaning 2 out of every 3 surveys was collected via QR. This tends to decrease our ability to infer to the entire museum population because that's not a random sample. The people who fill out the QR codes are not the same as the people who complete the survey in the standardized at exit random sample method that COVES has trained all of you on. So a few quick graphs. You can see here the huge difference between our smallest sites and our largest sites. I'm going to keep the scale the same on all of these slides super fast so you can see what's occurring here. So our smallest sample was 8, obviously that's under 100, and the largest sample was over 2,600. So we're going to exclude 16 sites for samples under 100. And then additionally, we look at the proportion of QR responses represented in the pink shaded bars here, and we've cut an additional 13 sites. So our final sample is 54 museums that are contributing data to this specific 2023 aggregate analysis. Now, for those of you who've been participating more than a year, you know that we also do statistical weighting to make sure that no specific site exerts undue influence on the aggregate findings. Meaning, if you're that site that collected 2,600 responses and your audience is really different than everyone else, that you don't pull any of the findings specific to your site. We take into account the total number of museums providing data, the individual sample size from each site, the total sample size across all sites, the percentage of target for each individual site, the number of months each museum participated, and of course the size. So a few notes here. You know what, we're going to skip the notes in the interest of time, but we put a lot of thought into this. It takes a lot of work, and it doesn't really change the data a whole bunch. However, you will see that the raw sample size shows that huge discrepancy between our smallest sites and our largest sites. And once we implement the statistical weights, we depress the large sample sizes at the top end so that they don't exert that undue influence, as I mentioned, and we don't change the smallest samples a whole lot. We just want to make sure they're representative and that they are not inflating any error caused by small sample sizes. So the final weighted sample sizes look like this. And you can see that we've reduced the range, the difference between the smallest sample and the largest sample, by over 1,000, which is huge in and of itself. And we still have a usable sample size of over 25,000 data points. So that's the nerdy part that I feel obligated to give before we do every aggregated analysis, because I geek out on this stuff. If you want to talk more about how we do weighting or why we have certain thresholds for data quality, please do let us know. Having said that, I'm going to start the aggregate data share out by priming you with a few questions. So remember that this is a cursory exploration of the 2023 data, right? This is not final. This slide deck you will have access to after the fact, but it's not going to go into print necessarily. It's not going to be in an aggregate report that we're publishing. We're pausing a month to kind of get some of our thoughts together about what's most important to report. So when you look through these data, keep in mind, what are you expecting to see? Specific data points, specific comparisons. What's missing? And if anything, what's most interesting, and what can we really push further in the completion of the aggregate report that we will soon begin working? All right, I'm going to pause and turn it over to Alex, and I'll also monitor the chat in case there's some, oh yes, Sarah, I can put the questions into the chat while Alex is going. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Great. And I also will say, please, as I describe these results, if you have questions or if you want to stop me, I don't know, please interrupt, because I would rather clarify something that's confusing before just steamrolling on. And Ryan and Sarah and Allison and folks, please stop me if there's questions in the chat that I'm missing, because there is, fair warning, a lot of data in here. And now I've lost my Zoom, so I'm going to find a way to share my screen. Okay. All right. So aggregate data results. So first, I just want to start out with, I'll start out with sort of our experience ratings. And I've tried to kind of, you'll see on the charts, threw up a little red kind of circle on a couple things that really honestly just to my eye test look like interesting differences. This is very preliminary, so it's not even really our practice to do a lot of statistical comparison at this stage, but just to say this looks a little bit different, looks a bit interesting, maybe want to say a couple words about it. Your eyes might see some different things that look interesting to you. That's totally fine. This is really just as I was exploring the data with Ryan, what kind of was starting to jump out to me. So I'll kind of lead with those, and then in each section, and then kind of show you some others where maybe there isn't as much difference, but that can also be interesting sometimes too. So on each slide, there's going to be on the left a chart that shows all the overall aggregate data, and then on the right, a chart comparing our art museums and our sort of science plus cohort, which is, everybody else, mostly science centers, children's museums, natural history museums, and it includes a couple other kind of miscellaneous sites as well. So with that, starting out with our overall experience rating chart. This is one where, and I'm going to talk about the science and art differences a little bit more because I think that's an interesting place to go. not really dramatic differences in the experience ratings that visitors are giving our different types of sites, and overall very, very positive. So I've shown you the breakdown for outstanding, excellent, good, fair, and poor, as well as this E+ rating, which is how sites sometimes report just as a single number the overall experience rating, which is adding up the percentage of excellent and the percentage of outstanding. So you see the overall E+ is almost 90%. And for the art museums, it's functionally, it's 89% right with rounding, and also super high for our science sites. So that's really cool to see. I mean, people, it's not a surprise. This is not groundbreaking, but people really like our museums. They love visiting. And similarly with Net Promoter Score, this is one where the differences are really pretty subtle. And not even that different. I mean, sometimes when I look at individual museum data, there's the variations all over the place. But when you look at it all together, those differences really get collapsed. And the Net Promoter Scores for science and art sites are virtually identical, right? We're right in that kind of low 70s, 71, with a couple of decimal, variations therein. Very consistent finding. Also, those of you who haven't been looking back for years and years at our aggregate data, this is really quite consistent. This like about 71 being our Net Promoter Score. So, even the breakdowns within the categories are quite similar between science and art. So those are the experience ratings I'm going to report. Next, I'm going to move to talking about some characteristics of visitor groups at museums. So what are we talking about here? So the first one huge difference between science and art sites. So this is group type, whether this is adult-only groups or groups that come with children. At our art sites, we see way more adult-only groups than groups that bring children with them. So this is one of the biggest differences we're going to see across the board at our different types of sites. 82% of art sites are, not bringing children with them, whereas at science centers, only 30%. And of course, that varies really widely depending on the science center as well. Some science centers have 0 or virtually 0% adult-only groups visiting, whereas some have, pretty substantial 40+% of their visitor groups are adult-only groups, just depending on what type of museum it is and how they, sort of choose to focus on different audiences. So, maybe not too surprising, but pretty dramatic difference here. Another relatively dramatic difference is in group size, and this is probably also related to that previous slide about adults only, adults and children. It's not, if you can come with your family, a typical kind of family size might be 2 parents and 2 kids. Right there, you've got a group of 3 to 4, which you see as our most common science center group size. Whereas at an art museum, if you're not bringing kids at all, you're probably not going to bring as big of a visiting group, maybe 1 adult going alone or adults in a pair. We do see some larger groups as well. So this is kind of a related finding, but just another pretty big difference between the visitation patterns at art sites and science sites. And then some other areas where, maybe this didn't jump out to me as being like, you do see some differences in terms of membership, like our science museums that in our cohort do have some higher membership percentages, but I think that's pretty variable from site to site, the way the membership programs are structured. And but just in terms of overall, around 20% in our aggregate, 18% of our visitors are members. And then that's a little bit higher for science, a little bit lower for our art sites. And then finally, for group characteristics, we have this question about sort of the self-identified question about, are you a local? Are you from out of town? Are you bringing someone who's out of town? As we all know, this doesn't always match up, exactly with like what you might consider local based on like zip codes or counties or something like that. But this is more at comparing in the aggregate to be interesting. And then also this idea of, are you bringing someone from out of town? Maybe your zip code is local, but you brought out of town visitors, and that's interesting to know. So there are some slight differences here as well. Slightly more, locals in the Science Center audiences, slightly more mixed and out of town groups in the art museum audience. So I see some questions in the chat, but I trust that you guys will stop me if anything is important. Okay, great.
Post methodological, nothing on the data as of just yet. So
love it. Okay.
Keep going.
So next is demographics. So this is going to be, again, a lot of these are going to be pretty regional. So it's hard to kind of, make definitive statements about art museums and science museums because we have museums all over the country, but starting out with a couple where, there might be fewer sort of regional differences, looking at age. So what I saw when I looked at the adult age breakdown is that our science centers, we see more, in comparison anyway, more of the sort of 25 to 44 range, and at art museums, more of the 55 plus, as well as actually more 18 to 24, although I didn't circle that one. But one really, I think, reasonable explanation for this could be that bringing children with you, the like typical family group, the 25 to 44, is a pretty common age for having young children that you're bringing with you to a science center or a children's museum. So that's going to be a little bit of a higher maybe proportion in the science center groups. Whereas I suppose the 55 plus group visiting art museums, that's I'm not sure exactly like how that breaks down, but you do still see that at science centers, people bringing grandkids or if they're guardians for children or something like that. But we do see that sort of senior citizen or more older audience represented higher at art museums as well. I'm not sure how to think about the 18 to 24 one, perhaps students and young adults, but I don't know about conjuring up a clear explanation for that, because we do see a lot of students and young adults at science centers as well, but perhaps less likely to be bringing their own children anyway, just with typical childbearing age in the US going up and up. Whereas 1824 in years past might have been more likely to bring children. I think now the 25 to 44 range is more likely to be bringing children with them. And then just correspondingly, child age definitely skews younger at our science centers. Children obviously absolutely go to art museums and or go with parents or families or guardians to art museums, but they do tend to be a little bit older. And I was actually interested to see the proportion of very young children at science centers. Over 20% of the children that we have data for at the science centers are very, very young. I know that's a big conversation in my science museum anyway, is providing opportunities for very young learners who might be coming, my science museum often traditionally will, aim the exhibits a little bit higher in age, like 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. But sort of including those early learners is very important. And of course, that's a totally different conversation at a children's museum where that's the absolute sweet spot. So just different contexts. But it's kind of cool to see such a higher proportion of like teens visiting art museums anyway. And then gender as well. This is one that kind of goes, these two slides I think kind of go together. So at our science centers, and this is kind of a trend that I've noticed over the years too, we do see slightly more, well, overall at the visitation pattern, more men than women, as well as we do have our non-binary category as well. A smaller percentage there, but more women than men tend to visit museums regardless. But the in terms of art museums and science museums, trend is still the same, but we see still like a few more women at art museums. Whereas for children, some things I thought were interesting. Comparing between science and art, more boys than girls at science centers and more girls than boys at art museums. And I also thought that this 2.6% non-binary children at art museums was really interesting. And I sort of am thinking that's probably related to the age of the, children or teens who are visiting. As you get a little bit older, it becomes a little bit easier to, or, you're more likely to be thinking about gender identity than like a 3-year-old who's still just kind of figuring out what the world is. But I thought that was really interesting to see, and really happy that we have that category available for adults and children now on the survey, which we did not in the same way when we started. We didn't have a non-binary called out explicitly.
Question about gender. Is it for, oh, maybe we just answered, in groups or respondents for adult and child?
It's all in groups, but it includes the respondent. So we pull the respondent in to that data. And then, so just moving on, educational attainment. Again, this can be pretty regional. I'm in the Boston area, super highly educated population around here. It's not the case for everywhere in the country. But one thing I did notice was the proportion of graduate degrees and above a little bit higher in our art sites. And correspondingly, college and below being a little bit higher in science sites. And this one was catching my eye because Ryan and I have been writing a journal article using some of these data And as part of the article, looking back at some visitor studies papers from like 30 years ago or so. And one thing I noticed, they even back in the early 90s and late 80s, people were talking about how highly educated museum visitor populations are. And there were actually a couple of papers where I was able to compare directly, and the proportion of visitors with graduate degrees is even higher than it was in the 90s. So maybe the population as a whole is getting more educated. That's one possible explanation, but I just noting that. And we'll be sure to share this article with the whole COVES community when it comes out, but that was one thing that I noticed. Are you overwhelmed yet? I hope not. So another one where there was a pretty interesting difference between science and art museums was the LGBT plus identification question. So at art museums, almost 20% of visitors are identifying as LGBT plus, which is fascinating to me. At museums across the board is 15%. And if you've ever heard people talk about population-wide estimates for who identifies as LGBT plus, it's really hard to measure. It's not a census question, and there's lots of different data sources for it, but I typically see it so much lower, like under 10%. And, I feel like there's a sort of a folk statistic that was floating around about 1 in 10 or something like that. But really have just seen this number go up so much since the beginning of COVES data collection, which is just really fascinating to me and really exciting to see, honestly. Next is race and ethnicity, and we've actually broken this down more like the way the census does it. So the first page, you won't see Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latinx origin on here because the census does separate them. So first, and again, this is can be pretty different depending on where in the country you are. So it's a little bit difficult to say, oh, art museums are doing this or science museums are doing this. But we do see some differences here in the between science and art. But overall, the majority of our museum visitors are still identifying as white, with the second highest categories being Asian or Asian American, or selecting multiple categories, followed by Black or African American. And then if you look at Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latinx origin, about 13% in the aggregate, and then 15-16% at science museums, about 10% at art museums. I have just a few more demographic pieces here. One of them being household income, which, as Ryan noted, was, our survey question where we do see the highest percentage of prefer not to say options. And I actually wonder if the survey change that we are making in the new fiscal year, I mean, I don't know if it will, but I would be interested to see if it changes at all the percentage of respondents who are selecting prefer not to say. If one possible reason is seeing those high incomes is a little bit off-putting for people, perhaps it might change it, or perhaps it might not. Remains to be seen. But this is a little bit hard to sort of parse, admittedly, but the most common income category, if you look at just the aggregate overall, is that sort of 100 to 150K is household income. And then interestingly, the second most common is the highest category of 200K plus. And then, at science, that's even when you split out art and science, that's the highest category. So, a lot of higher income, highly educated visitors at our museums.
Alex, quick question here. Did we remove the prefer not to say?
We did. Prefer not to say is removed in all of these graphs.
And it should be noted for this question explicitly, this is still the question where we get the highest percentage of people who prefer not to provide a response.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think last is the disability question. And this one is virtually identical at our art and science sites, but about 10% of our visitors across the board at our museums identify as having a disability, or someone in their group has a disability. And I do think that is lower than, I haven't checked the US Census number yet, but I do think that is a bit lower than what we see in the census numbers in general. So that's kind of the here's all the data throwing at you rundown here. And so just finally, now that we have this, in addition to this article we're writing for visitor studies, we're planning our next aggregate report. I know when COVID hit, we kind of fell out of the more standard practice of doing aggregate reports, but we're really, really excited to jump back into that. So some things we're thinking about are, of course, members are different. We know this from years of COVES data and pre-COVES. I think we all knew that members were a little bit different than non-members, but how? And what does that look like at art museums versus science museums, or perhaps even subtypes of museums beyond just art and science? Maybe doing a little bit more to compare to the national census. Doing that on a institution by institution basis has been a little bit too heavy of a lift for us, but if we can just use aggregate data and then say we're looking at the national census numbers, it's a little bit easier to wrap your head around. So thinking about places where we can make that comparison in the aggregate report, we're really looking forward to. Of course, organizational differences, as you saw, that was kind of the idea of this whole presentation, was to do those comparisons. And maybe also thinking about comparisons between museum size. And we've gotten some questions recently about geography, the West Coast, East Coast, but also all the different AAM regions in terms of like the Mountain Plains region, the Midwest region, Southeast. What kind of differences do we see across the board there? So that's really what we have for you today. And I would be just really interested to know if anyone has questions or thoughts about anything we could dig into further as we explore this data more.
Yeah, there's some interesting comments in the chat. So I actually don't need to regurgitate everything. If you're on the call and you put something in the chat and you want to talk about it, please feel free to take yourself off mute and jump right in. Camera on or off, up to you.
I put in the paid versus free because I do think that might impact Net Promoter Score and overall experience rating. I do think people connect value with things that they've paid for. So I've noticed our scores are not like significantly lower for outstanding ratings, but they are lower. And I've always just attributed to the fact that people have kind of wandered in here, so their expectations are set differently.
That's great. I would love to dig into that. If I didn't put it in the chat, I'll say it out loud. I'm not sure all the museums that are free versus paid. We would literally need to ask everyone to make sure that we have accurate data to be able to split that, but that would be easy enough to do for the next analysis and moving forward. So free versus paid.
I'll second that as a free museum, because I think it's also not just, I mean, our ratings are great, but in terms of satisfaction, but I think there are patterns of frequency of visit or length of visit or things like that, or portion that are members that are visit that can vary because, with or without an admission fee. So yes, I would second that.
Question for the community. We just started talking about geographic comparisons, and as Alex mentioned, one of the things that has been floated our way was like East Coast versus West Coast, but that's not really, that's not included. We need to do better than that. AAM has regions that COVES has adopted for at a minimum, just like a defined, these states are in this region, and so we can categorize people. When you think about it, when you think about what you want for a geographic comparison, are you really interested in like just splitting the country into left and right, more or less? Are you interested in all of the different regions? And I think there are 5 that AAM counts. What is the preference for, is it 6 or 5?
6.
6, excuse me, 6 regions for AAM. When you think about geographic comparisons, what's most helpful for you all?
And if you're curious or not familiar with them, I dropped a map of the AAM regions in the chat.
And maybe you vote on that in the chat as a follow-up to Allison's link. But we're definitely interested in that as we think about geographic comparisons.
Yeah, so Lauren Hawley here. We're in Houston, and trying to remember COVES organizations in my range, but I remember during COVID, Elisa and I had very similar audiences. So I don't know, and it looks like she's in a different area, but St. Louis and Houston, I feel like are very aligned in terms of out on the floor mentalities. But
yes,
yeah, I don't think it's necessarily like exactly a match when that might be a match with the rest of my AAM region. I don't know. Sorry, I realized I was a little rambly and not helpful.
Perhaps large metropolitan areas versus smaller. Maybe. I mean, our metropolitan area is like 15 million people in LA, so it's pretty different than a lot combined.
Yeah, but like size of city, we're like Beth, you and I are really similar, so we're right behind you. But I see, yeah, I'm wondering if there's kind of two ways of thinking about it, and maybe we're exploring it where we can do like big city, more rural kind of thing, like mid-sized cities, rural, and then we can also do by AM region. And then I don't know, maybe we have a way that we can even ask institutions that we know, like for me and Elisa, if we're like, want to do a meetup of some kind where we just do a little review of some sort where it's like, hey, we notice some similarities between these audiences. I know that's a ton of work, but I don't know, it'd be interesting to be able to find some clusters of like organizations that are seeming to hold together that you might not realize are similar peers to you.
I cringe to say this, but red state, blue state.
Sometimes saying the obvious is the way to say it.
Yeah.
Or really, like, are we matching the demographics of our states, right? Like the demographic differences could be due to, in some ways, historic, motivational, or are we matching the people who live near us? And that also gets confusing with locals versus non-locals. We do that comparison a lot. The demographics are locals versus are not locals. I was going to throw out there with the free museums. Many of us paid museums actually give out a lot of free tickets, and we have a custom question for ticket type. So even though we are a paid museum, we can do comparisons with folks who come for free.
I'm looking back at the questions that Ryan posed at the start, at the top of the chat, and realizing like it's hard. I'm having trouble tracking the chat, which I think is why we're all silent right now. I'm wondering about this question of like, what is most interesting should be pushed further. Other things that are wondering what people think, and or if there's a way to, I doubt it, that was a lot of slides, like to look at them in a small little, so we can like look at the whole deck, but it's probably too small to share, screen share. So 2 points. I wish I could look back at all the things you just talked through because it still feels fast, even though you're taking your time. And what do people find most interesting?
I guess I'll just throw out, I'm curious about how people's institutions like to define the aggregate. So we only compare ourselves to medium to large institutions, and only in science and not child focused, because those are considered more of our peers. And even we've wavered on comparing to medium versus large, but it does add a bigger sample size. So when we draw our institutional comparisons, that's what we do.
Yeah, Sarah, you're right. I'm definitely like lost in the chat a little bit because there's so much interesting stuff in here.
We'll keep populating the chat because we can
Mhm.
save this and we can kind of come back to it as the
Mhm.
COVES team and kind of push the analyses. I just wanted to respond to Beth and say, like, that's really interesting, and it makes total sense, right? Like, kind of finding peers, because that's a reliable benchmark. I'm just curious if the rest or the more robust COVES aggregate gives you more like exemplary or, you know, more variance to say like, wow, we're really below these small museums or these rural museums or these other museums, or we're way above, right? Like, does it give you additional context to situate even the peer group, whether or not that's just yourself or the groups that you've been most frequently comparing to?
I would get a lot of flack for
Mm,
not comparing to like institutions.
yeah,
I'd get a lot of, but
sure.
they can do this because,
Uh-huh.
but that's really different. So I think our exec staff and our board really wants to compare to what we can consider peers.
Well, and that's good because in the past, and I think we can replicate this for the report, we did exactly, I think exactly what you're describing, which is looking at size differences by cohort, right? Art, science, small, medium, large. So we can absolutely pull that out fairly easily. More than two variables, right? More than two grouping characteristics. And I think the comparison or any kind of analysis we did would break down because it would be like a three-dimensional graph or something, and it would break my brain. I mean, plotting it.
This is making me wonder about being outside of an institution. I'll just name it for all of you who are grappling with this for reality in your work. But like, are our ideas of who are our peers stacking up to the way that visitors, that respondents to our survey think about us? Like, I'm wondering about whether there is more here of, is it institution size? Is it budget size? Is it region? Like, is how we're, right, Beth, like how you're being asked to compare, are there other elements of other institutions that are actually also, you know, comparable in ways that are surprising to us? It's like it feels like it's in the realm of Ryan's big questions, and I want to use the 40,000 data points kind of to explore. And I'm wondering if we have enough data. And to your point, Ryan, you might have just said essentially no. Like if we break it down too much, you know, some of our multi-layered categories might be too small to compare. But I feel like there's something interesting there sort of for the field of who are our peers? How do we need to think differently about this based on how people experience us versus how we think about myself versus another institution?
Yeah, and I'd like to second what Molly was saying about university museums. We often wonder how the fact that we are tied to a university impacts our visitor data, just out of curiosity, but we haven't really dug into trying to actually compare that.
I mean, that's an interesting one too, because that's not a clean science art thing. We have a number of university affiliated art museums as well. And it would be not unlike something like child focused, which I don't think there are any child focused art museums in our cohort. And I don't know what that would look like, but if there are those in the country, if there are, I would love to visit them. Yeah, there's a lot of diversity in the museum type that falls under the university category.
And we have some information from you or from our assumptions about those subtypes. So I think that'd be something where we need to identify the subtypes and assign them to make sure that we're not calling out a single institution that is a very specific subtype. But that is definitely something that we can look into. I'm going to drop in the chat some subtypes that we have previously identified, and we can look at what would be a big enough clumps to do those comparisons.
And I'm seeing Daphne's comment in the chat as well. I like, and I think if I'm interpreting this correctly, the interest in a comparison between quote unquote a control group, right? Like the national census data to get a better bearing on what these numbers mean. And I agree. I think that for the descriptives, you know, if it's not a group comparison, art versus science, small, medium, large, etc., I think providing the national census benchmarks or reference points would be helpful, just so we can all see how that is contextualized. It's of course wildly inaccurate region to region, but if we're looking at the country as a whole and we're talking about 100 museums or 54 museums across the country, I think that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Beth, this came up, I'm not sorry if someone already said it, the natural history museums thing, it goes along with what Sarah was just saying about, if we limit the comparison too much, how valid are the comparisons and at what point do the data become identifiable? Because we try to do like a head count or institution count, and we basically only got to like 4 natural history museums and, children's museum, like all of our subgroups are fairly small when you get into it, even on the art museum side. If you're encyclopedic, if you're university affiliated, if you're, single artist, things like that. So we need to consider those subgroups pretty carefully before we get into reporting. But that is something we should explore as our overall group size expands, because that's the direction we should be headed. And recruiting more of them, right? Get your Natural History Museum friends involved. Okay, sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I also wonder if that's an area where museums might have multiple subtypes. And yeah, we need to think about that a little bit. But yeah, could be good, could be better, could beef up each of the categories a little bit.
Yeah. So I just want to be conscious of the time. We're approaching the end of the hour. This has been a really good conversation. And of course, we're just really scratching the surface. But as we head towards our fiscal year analysis and try and do kind of a more robust job, right? The thing that will be in print, the thing that will live beyond a webinar like this. If you have comments in the chat that you want to kind of expand on for our benefit or yours, please let us know. We're going to be in the thinking phase for basically the next month, and then it's going to be numbers crunching, graph producing, graphic design, coordinating, all the hard stuff that lead to the fancy version. So let's capitalize on some of these ideas sooner than later to see what's possible for the final aggregate report for this fiscal year. But thanks to all. This has been a great conversation, great idea generation. It's great to see so many of you. Please be on the lookout for our upcoming Community of Practice webinar announcements. As many of you probably remember, we consolidate July and August into July-August because schedules are so weird. We're looking forward to a good conversation there. And then we're hoping to come back to you in September with this idea, the aggregate data share out redone, but kind of like formal and final in advance of the aggregate report itself. So stay tuned. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Hope wherever you are in the country, you're staying cool, staying safe, staying healthy, whatever you need to do in your region, given how weird things are. So take care. Talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone. Make sure we save the chat.
It saves automatically.
Oh, yeah, it saves automatically.
And if not, I have redundantly saved it.
Nice.
For redundancy's sake.
I like that.